Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, we are going to be talking about working with migrant families under threat, really focusing on assessment, support, and resources. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can dive in because I want to be respectful of your time, and get you back to your day. All righty. So before we get started, I do want to let you know that this training will be recorded for those who may not be able to attend live or would like to review it later. You are not required to have your camera on, so please feel free to participate in whatever way feels most comfortable for you. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Tony Kelly. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the CEO and founder of Tony Kelly Counseling and Consulting. Here in Nashville, I own a private practice where I provide therapy, clinical supervision, and consultation. And I've also integrated immigration evaluations into my work, and that is something I am very proud of. So, a significant part of what I do involves supporting individuals and families who are navigating both mental health concerns and complex immigration related stressors. Before we get started, I would like to get a sense of who is the room. I know we have a couple attendees. You can go ahead and drop your name in the chat so that you all can network amongst each other. I won't call it out loud for the sake of the recording, but I do again want to thank you for attending. Throughout my work, I've seen firsthand how legal vulnerabilities and systemic barriers and chronic uncertainty can add chronic stress to clients that we are serving. And it can also impact their overall functioning and engagement in care. And so today we're going to spend some time focusing on the work that we do with migrant families, but more specifically, focusing on the work we do with migrant families who are living under ongoing threat, whether that's fear of deportation, family separation, or broader systemic uncertainty. And so, what makes the context unique is that the stress can be ongoing, and it is not something that has just happened in the past. It is something that these individuals are dealing with on a daily basis. And that creates fear, and that fear can impact how they think, how they feel, how they behave, and how they engage in services. So today we want to provide some context in terms of how can we best support these family systems, and really find practical ways to think about interacting with them and helping them meet their need. The goal today is really for this to be informative, and hopefully you will leave with something that is applicable, and that you can take directly into the work that you're doing with families. So, to start, I want us to walk through what we'll be focusing on. First, we are going to look at how racialized trauma and chronic fear, not just trauma in the traditional sense, but ongoing systemic and identity based trauma and how it impacts people. Then from there, we'll examine how fear affects day-to-day functioning and help seeking behavior. And this is really important because many behaviors that we interpret as avoidance or noncompliance is often can have a very different explanation when we look at how the individual is having to interact with their system. And then we'll apply that understanding into assessment, really looking at how we can work with these family members from a trauma-informed assessment way that is responsive to immigration-related stress and fear. We'll explore the barriers that will impact care. That can be both systemic and psychological. And then we'll talk about how those barriers can cause someone to limit interaction, which leads to decreased engagement. And then the last thing we'll talk about are practical, culturally responsive interventions and strategies that you can realistically implement in your day-to-day work. And so overall, the goal is really for you to understand behavior and engagement so that you can feel more confident in how you respond. And we want you to respond in an informed, intentional, and effective way. So why is this even important? Nowadays, we are seeing increased visibility of immigration enforcement. This can be seen through policy changes, media coverage, and what's happening within our communities. And so, consequently, what we're seeing is a heightened sense of fear within immigrant communities. And that fear isn't just hypothetical, it is a real day to day lived experience for these families. And it is also real to them because they're also hearing what other people are experiencing within their community. And so, one of the biggest impacts we see clinically is reduced engagement within the healthcare system, within other systems where they may need support. And this can then result in them avoiding care, them avoiding systems, and then these individuals disengaging from the support that they need. And so at the same time, as we are noticing an increase in racialized narratives, this is then causing an increase in stigma. And then this leads to mistrust and a sense of unsafety within systems. And so when we're working with families and individuals, we're not just working with personal stress, we're working within a broader social and political context that directly shapes how people feel. And in that context, it is very critical because it helps us to really understand the influences that is leading to engagement with us. So let's get some key definitions out of the way so that we as a unit are really understanding throughout this presentation what we are talking about. The first term that I want to talk about is migrant families. Here I'm referring broadly to families navigating migration related experiences. This can include legal vulnerability, undocumented status, or mixed statuses within households. Next is racialized trauma. Here we are specifically talking about trauma rooted in ongoing exposure to discrimination, systemic inequities, and threats. Importantly, this is not just a one time event. Racialized trauma is often chronic, it's cumulative, and it is tied to one's identity. And then when we are talking about chronic fear, toxic stress, what we are talking about is the ongoing activation of someone's body's stress response system. And so when individuals are living under constant uncertainty, their nervous system doesn't have the opportunity to fully reset. And then when we talk about structural vulnerability, we are talking about vulnerability that is really referring to the risk that is being created by systems, including immigration policy, access to healthcare, economic barriers, and legal systems. So rather than locating the problem within the individual, we really need to recognize that much of what our clients and the families we are engaging with, they are engaging with a lot of potential risk. And because of this, that can then result in them showing up in a way that seems like they are suffering from certain like severe disorders or diseases, but what it can mean to us if we are really looking at it is that this person may be driven to certain responses due to constant fear. And so, what is racialized trauma? We are really looking at that framework. Racialized trauma and really understanding that is the foundation to everything that we do when we are working with migrant families, because this helps us really understand and what they are going through and not misinterpret what we're seeing clinically. As we move through this, I do want to invite you to think about different individuals, families that you are currently working with, and I want you to think about what you may be seeing and what patterns you are noticing. When we talk about racialized trauma, we're referring to trauma that is directly tied to experiences of racism, discrimination, and systemic inequities. That can have a strong and growing, so there's a strong body of research that is really focusing on these experiences and what are the real impacts on that, both mentally and physically. And this can include direct experiences such as targeted or mistreatment, but also vicarious experiences like witnessing harm, hearing about stories within their community, or other people, or being exposed to media rhetoric that is harmful. And so racial trauma is sometimes often referred to as race-based stress. And that includes and involves perceived or real threats of harm, experiences of humiliation or shaming. One of the key things that I do want you to understand is that race-based stress and racialized trauma is different from traditional PTSD. And it's different because it involves repeated exposure over time. And it's not just a single event with a clear beginning and end. These individuals and any person of color is 9 times out of 10 navigating in systems that were not made for them. So they are on a day-to-day basis or a very consistent basis. They are interacting in spaces where they are not wanted. And so, one thing that we also have to consider that really heightens racialized trauma and race based stress is intersectionality, how race interacts with immigration status, language, gender, and other identities. And so, over time, these repeated exposures to this trauma and stress then causes the individual to look at the world differently, and they no longer see it as trust. They no longer see it as safe. They no longer trust, and so they don't want to engage in the systems. So let's shift now and let's really talk about the role of fear. This is really the basis of what we're trying to understand. When we talk about fear in this context, we're not talking about something occasional or situational. We're talking about fear that is ongoing and that really shapes someone's day-to-day life. For many migrant families, there is a constant fear of deportation, family separation, and interacting with systems like law enforcement, healthcare, or the courts. And so, what we are seeing is that this chronic threat or this navigating in this chronic threat environment causes them to have to continuously anticipate what may happen next. And then, importantly, the fear then requires them to always be thinking ahead so they can never be engaged in what is presently happening. And that possibility alone could drive someone to anxiety, hypervigilance, and increased stress. When we are thinking about mixed status families, they too are often, the children can be living in constant fear, fear that the parent can be detained or deported. And then this creates an emotional strain and a lot of pressure for the children within the family system. And so the fear also isn't contained to just one person. It can be transmitted within the family, it can be transmitted within the community. And then over time, what you see is heightened anxiety, constant monitoring of one's environment, and then reduced sense of safety. And then this is where it becomes clinically important for us to really see behaviors not as avoidance or withdrawal or a hesitancy to engage, but really for us to take a deeper dive into what is the root of this and how is one viewing the world. So when we are thinking about that fear and that fear becoming chronic, it not only impacts behavior, it also impacts psychological functioning. When fear is ongoing, it doesn't just stay contained in an emotional aspect. Then starts to impact the brain, the body, and behavior in very pervasive ways. When we look at the research, SAMHSA says that trauma results from experiences that are perceived as threatening and leads to lasting effects across emotional, physical, and psychological functioning. And so, one of the most common responses that we see is hypervigilance, which is a constant state of alertness and scanning for danger. We also see anxiety and depression, and that can be due to chronic uncertainty and lack of feeling unsafe. We can see sleep disturbances. This is where someone may have difficulty falling asleep. They are frequently waking up or they're having nightmares. And this is because their stress response system is constantly activated. And then over time, the trauma impacts someone's ability to emotionally regulate themselves. And so it makes it harder for them to manage stress and regulate reactions or respond in a proportionate way to certain situations. And then the last thing I want to stress is that this chronic fear can also lead to somatic symptoms. Those are headaches, gastrointestinal issues, heart palpitations, things that would cause someone to go see a medical provider. This can then reflect how chronic stress and really thinking about how it can be embedded in the body. And so you think about someone trying to navigate with all of these symptoms, but still go to work and show up as a parent, a caregiver, and those different things. And so We really have to look at these as adaptive survival responses and not look at it from a disease model. When we talk about neurobiological impact, chronic exposure to fear and stress doesn't just affect emotions, it also affects one's core neurobiological system and how that impacts someone's ability to survive, their memory, and regulate themselves. One of the first chronic activation responses that we notice is the chronic activation of the HPA axis. And you're like, what the heck is this? This is the hypothalamus. This is the pituitary gland. These are the adrenal glands. This is your body's main response system. And so, if this is constantly activated, this means that it is in a constant fight or flight state. Then we are thinking about memory. And if someone is constantly dealing with memory or constantly dealing with fear, then this impacts the hippocampus system, which then affects memory and learning. And so you may be engaging with migrant families and children whose parents are undocumented who may have difficulty with learning. Or they may be having difficulty with memory and repetition and those different things. And so that is something to also think about. And then when we think about the prefrontal cortex, when when the prefrontal cortex is constantly exposed to, or when one person is constantly exposed to constant fear, their prefrontal cortex is being impacted. And what does the prefrontal cortex do for us? It helps us to make decisions, it helps us to plan, it helps us to deal with impulse control. And so, if you're under chronic stress, these abilities become less efficient, then impact your judgment. And so then the last thing I want to talk about is the executive functioning. If we are constantly on a state of fear, we cannot do these high level things that that part of our brain needs to do. And so then over time, that interferes with our daily functioning, our relationships, and our engagement in care. And so when we think about how these changes show up in real world behavior, one of the most significant areas is help seeking. Trauma and chronic fear don't just affect internal experiences, they directly shape whether, when, and how someone seeks help. So, one of the most common patterns that we see is avoidance of services. If someone is under constant fear, they can avoid getting medical care, they can avoid accessing mental health services, and they can avoid engaging in legal services when they truly need it. There's often a fear of exposure and that their personal information would be shared and their undocumented status will be shared. And so as a result, they feel the need to protect. And then this can lead to them withdrawing. It's also important to emphasize that this fear, again, is not hypothetical. You remember earlier I said that racialized trauma and race-based stress is constant and it's chronic. And so these individuals and people of color are engaging in systems where their experiences are not always validated. And so, according to the research, immigrant families can delay and avoid care. Even when their children are eligible for services, they can avoid it because their fear that their legal status will be found out. And so, then what we see is a lower utilization of mental health services, healthcare services, and services to meet one's basic needs. So, with that in mind, the question then becomes how do we assess? And then from that assessment, how do we then interpret it, what is truly happening? At this point, we've really talked about racialized trauma, chronic fear, and the impact. Now, I really want us to talk about the assessment process. Because if we don't assess within the right context, we risk misinterpreting symptoms, behaviors, and presentation. So, when we talk about trauma and trauma informed assessment, we're not just talking about assessing, we are really talking about how we are approaching the process in itself. SAMHSA outlines a few key principles that guide trauma informed work that are really important that I wanted to highlight. The first one is safety. We need to make sure that in our assessment process, we are thinking about physical and psychological safety. Clients need to feel safe in the environment and in their interaction with you. This could include how questions are asked, your tone of voice, your body language. This also can include how much control the client feels that they have. Without safety, the information we get can be incomplete and inaccurate because they're not going to share their story with you. The second one is trustworthiness. This is built through transparency, consistency, and clear communication. We need to be explaining why we're asking questions, how that information will be used, what are the limits in terms of confidentiality, because many of the individuals we work with, they will have valid reasons to not trust us. And so it is critical that we fully inform them in the very beginning. The third is cultural humility. Trauma doesn't exist outside of culture or context. What does this mean? This means that we need to be aware of the power dynamics that we have as helping professionals or as someone in the legal system. And then what that then does for the individual in terms of their ability to seek out help. The last principle that I want to highlight is empowerment. Because trauma often involves a loss of control and assessment, a loss of control, assessment should actively be used to restore their voice, to give them choice, to give them the ability to choose. And so, whether that's pacing the conversation, allowing the client to decline certain questions, also making sure we have interpreters or other services involved. And so, what I want you to take away from this is really thinking that assessment process is not just about gathering information, it is about creating a context where someone feels safe, because if they feel safe, they will be more inclined to talk about their journey. Now that we've talked about building safety and the engagement process, let's talk about when they are sharing their story. What information do we need? When we are conducting trauma-informed assessments, especially in immigration-related work, we're not just assessing symptoms, we're assessing the context surrounding the individual's experience. We need to really think about these key factors. First, what is their fear level and what is their perceived fears and perceived threats? This could include fear of deportation, harm to self or family, or past trauma. Fear is important because it drives the severity in which someone navigates life. Second basic need is really thinking about housing, food, and safety. If these individuals are not able to meet their basic needs, then they will be less inclined to get the help that they need. And then third, we have to think about social supports. Um, this can include family, community, cultural, spiritual networks. Strong support systems are one of the most consistent protective factors that we can see in trauma recovery. And then the last one I want to highlight is that immigration related stressors. This can include legal uncertainty, language barriers, financial strains, and that's not just the background factors that can be impacting of the individual. We really have to think about how this contributes to chronic stressors. So what I really want you to think about and the information to take from this is and a comprehensive assessment goes beyond just looking at one's symptoms. We want to look at fear, stability, support, and then how is the system contributing to the stress. When we think about how our client may present themselves, we really have to think about certain behaviors that we could misinterpret. One of the most common patterns is minimization or withholding of information. The client may downplay their symptoms, they may lead out specific details that are very important. And keep in mind, this is not driven by a need to manipulate, this can be driven by fear. Again, fear of what the consequences could be if they share their story. Also, we can talk about inconsistent narratives, changes in timelines, gaps in memories. Remember early on, we said that if the hippocampus is being impacted, that can create gaps in memory. And so, again, this may not be deception. 9 times out of 10, this may be this person is navigating through intense fear. And so, there are just certain patterns and consequences psychologically that are appearing. Then, when we talk about somatic symptoms, they may show up physically with headaches, stomach issues, fatigue, and sometimes that can be misinterpreted as laziness. And we really have to understand that that is not the case. And we really need to dig further. And then the last thing is avoidance. They can avoid certain topics, they can delay attending appointments, they can completely disengage from care. And avoidance is a core trauma response that can be amplified by the fear of authorities, deportation, and family separation. And so these are some things that we clinically have to be mindful of when we think about the client's presentation. Let's talk about the structural barriers. Up until this point, we talked a lot about fear and trauma, but really we need to also talk about the systems and the systems that our clients are navigating in. Research shows that immigration or immigrant populations often have equal or even greater mental health needs, but they access services at a significantly lower rate. And these gaps are not just, accidental. These are shaped by policies, access limitations, and other broader social climate. Even now we think about banks now will potentially be asking for people to prove their legal status now. And so one major barrier that I want us to highlight is language access and access to language services. um, this can lead to communication issues and difficulty navigating spaces. Another is insurance eligibility. That can impact how or create significant gaps in care because the person doesn't have the coverage to pay for the services. Then we think about transportation, and this is a barrier because the lack of reliable transportation then limits one to be able to go to work, drop off their kids for childcare, and then this just creates additional financial strain. And the last structural barrier that I want to highlight is the documentation status, and that plays a significant role. It can impact eligibility, willingness to seek care, and then overall sense of safety. And so then as a result, the immigrant families may avoid services because they're very fearful of what will be asked of them. Just quickly, I want to highlight the psychological barriers, and we've talked about this in some earlier slides, but I do want to highlight how the fear of deportation causes one to not engage. We've said that multiple times. Um, the fear of deportation, again, is not hypothetical. It is something that is chronic and a lived experience. And so many individuals and their families are navigating constant fear of separation and anxiety. And then as a result, they isolate and don't want to interact with the systems. Also, as a result and as a consequence, they start to mistrust the systems and they start to have a negative view about the systems and how the systems could help. And then, as we see shame and stigma, cultural and community norms can really shape how mental health is understood. And then, as a result, the individuals may minimize their distress and avoid seeking help. And just, and then, as a result, they are not taking care of their physical and emotional needs. We would be doing a disservice if we didn't talk about the impact of the current climate. The broader social and political climate plays a critical role in shaping mental health and overall well being. What happens at the policy and societal level doesn't just stay there, it really translates into real psychological effects for individuals and for their families. And so, one major factor that we have to think about is policy related uncertainty. Immigration policies have shifted very quickly, and they are causing a lot of us on a day-to-day basis to be uncertain about futures and just being able to plan. And so more restrictive immigration policies then lead to increased psychological distress. Also, what we're noticing is the impact of public rhetoric and media narratives, and those can influence stigma and increase feelings of exclusion and then increase isolation. And then the last thing is really community-wide stress. As a result of the current climate, there is a lot of stress within our immigrant communities because they are in a constant state of fear. And then over time, that fear impacts how they show up in the world. Up until this point, we talked a lot about risk and barriers, but I do want to talk about, and I do want to recognize and center the strengths and resilience of migrant families. Many of the individuals and families that we work with have navigated very complex systems. They've survived significant adversity, and they've made very difficult decisions in the pursuit of safety and opportunity. And so I really want us to think about and to focus on the strengths. What are the protective factors and what are the adaptive capabilities that support these families to keep going on a day-to-day basis? So when we talk about resilience in this context, it's really important for us to move away from the idea that it's an individual trait, but I really want you to think about it in the terms of a collective community. What we often see in intergenerational resilience is that families are carrying forward their strengths that they have developed through prior experiences of adversity and migration. We also see strong family systems where they support each other and they're very protective of each other. We also see spirituality and faith, and those being central coping strategies to provide meaning and a sense of hope. And then many communities are relying on collective coping, shared problem solving, support, and community based care, where they're basically saying, we will take care of ourselves and we will take care of each other. And so the key takeaway here is that resilience is not just something individuals have, it is something that can be supported and sustained through relationships, through culture, and through community. And so, as providers, it is our role to recognize that, to validate that, to build on those strengths. And when our clients are feeling overwhelmed, to pull them back into and encourage them to go back into their communities. Other protective factors are, let me give you a definition of protective factors first. Protective factors are the conditions and resources that help individuals and families cope more effectively with adversity. And so, one of the protective factors that we notice within migrant families is community networks, really providing social support to each other, which then brings a sense of belonging. Another one is cultural identity, a very strong cultural identity where it provides stability, meaning, and connection. And we saw this when Bad Bunny performed at the NFL and just the pride with all amongst Hispanic communities and how they felt just to see one of them performing, in something that big. And this supports self-worth. It helps individuals stay connected. And it helps people to really talk about their shared values. And then the last thing is meaning making. This is how the individuals interpret and make sense of their experiences, whether that's through spirituality, personal values, or really reframing their adversities. So, with understanding of the risks, but also with the understanding of migrant family and their resilience, the question then becomes, what is our role as providers? So I really want us to shift into application and what this means for us in practice. Because while we can't eliminate systemic barriers, we can significantly influence how safe, accessible, and responsible our services feels to our clients, whether that is mental health services, legal services, services to help them find food resources. Every provider at this point really needs to think about being a source of entry into care, being a source of information, and providing that support and really bridging one to those critical resources. At the core of this looks like us really building trust. And really, with the trust, we really have to think about that trust is not automatic. If we want to build trust, there are three key things that we need to think about. First, we need to think about transparency. Are we being clear about our role? Are we telling them why we're asking questions? Are we telling them how the information will be used? Are we telling them about the limits of confidentiality? Then also consistency. Are we following through? Are we maintaining our boundaries? If we say we were going to show up for a home visit at 4, did we show up for that home visit at 4 o'clock? And then the last approach is really a non-judgmental approach. And this is very critical. Many of our clients carry shame or fear that they will be misunderstood. So, really, how we show up is really important. We really have to be mindful of our tone of voice. We have to be mindful of our own personal biases or assumptions. And we really have to work on our responses. Um, all of those different things and all of these three components can really either create safety or remove safety from the situation. And so once that foundation of trust is built, one of the important shifts that we really need to think about is, are the families that we are serving, are their basic needs being met? If someone is worried about safety, if they're worried about housing, lack of food, it really becomes difficult to engage them in services and to engage with them at any level. So before we move into high level interventions, we need to really think about making sure that migrants' families' basic needs are being met. One of the key pieces to this is safety planning, really thinking about immediate risk and developing plans in a crisis situation. Another one is resource connection. This can include linking clients to housing support, legal support, and community-based resources. And keep in mind, because of the fear of safety, this goes beyond you just giving them a name and a number. Sometimes we need to do that warm transfer. Sometimes we need to make that phone call for them while they're in front of us and introduce them to the individual. And then in many cases, case management approach can really be helpful because it helps to really coordinate care, it helps people navigate systems, and it reduces barriers. And so from there, let's look at some very practical strategies. I talked about it a little bit earlier, those warm handoffs. Instead of just giving a referral, we need to be present to make that call. And this can reduce anxiety and uncertainty because us, as the trusted individual, is now sending them to someone who we trust. Another piece is really community partnerships. We do know that funding across the board is decreasing a lot. And so it is important for a lot of us who are in nonprofits or other community-based organizations to really start building those partnerships. And then we have to really think about flexibility and flexible care. Are we providing flexible scheduling? Do we have telehealth options? Are we adapting the sessions to meet the childcare demands and those different things? And so when we talk about trauma-informed interventions, once safety and basic needs are addressed, we can then start to introduce interventions that support regulation and engagement. And so these are not just techniques, these are interventions that are grounded in understanding trauma and designed to avoid re-traumatization and to promote safety and empowerment. And so one core approach is grounding. Are we helping people learn how to return to their present moment? Deep breathing. Are we reducing psychological arousal and those different things so that one can decrease their anxiety and hypervigilance? Another key component is psychoeducation. Are we helping our clients to understand how trauma affects the brain and body? Because then that can remove shame and stigma, and that can validate their experiences. We also want to normalize fear responses and really think about the context in which fear and anxiety is contributing to one's experience. And then throughout all of that, we want to maintain a strengths-based approach, which we are really identifying what has helped the individual cope and survive, and how can we build on that. As clinician, and whether we are a lawyer, a nonprofit owner, CEO, or whomever, we need to constantly be educating ourselves on what is happening within the immigration systems and with immigration policies nowadays. So we have to constantly educate ourselves and stay informed. Another thing is to remember and that we are constantly doing trainings on remaining culturally humble, really referring to our biases and our own assumptions and how that shows up in our work. And then the last thing I really want to talk about again and go talk a little bit more is about our biases and really thinking about how, how those biases can impact how we carry out the work that we're doing, and then how does that impact assessment, and then how does that impact care. And so I'd lastly want to close by talking about advocacy. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but if we are going to work with migrant families and really meet their needs, again, advocacy is going to be a big part of the work that we do. We can do this by partnering with community organizations. And through that work, we can better reduce barriers and really think about promoting equitable and care that is accessible. And so to close, I want to highlight a few key points to carry forward into your work. First, I want you to remember that fear drives behavior. Many of the behaviors we see, avoidance, withdrawal, inconsistency, they are often rooted in fear. Second, survival needs shape engagement. When basic needs like safety, housing, and stability are not met, engagement becomes secondary. And so this may look like disengagement, but this is often or can be actually someone just trying to prioritize survival. Then, when we think about trust, trust precedes treatment. Without trust, meaningful intervention will be very limited. And so, trust is built through transparency, consistency, and safety. And engagement depends on whether someone feels safe or not. And then finally, strengths. We really need to think about our client and migrant families' strengths. We need to think about their resilience, their cultural strengths, their cultural pride, and really think about the strong systems that they have. And so effective care really means recognizing these strengths and then building on that. And so as you move forward in your work, I invite you to really keep the lens in mind or keep this lens in mind. When we shift from pathology to context and from deficits to strengths and from compliance to safety, then we create spaces that will be more effective, more ethical, and will provide more passionate care. So I do want to thank you all for your time. I do want to, if we open it up to any questions, but I do want for us to really think about from today's presentation, what are you going to take with you, and how are you going to apply that in the day-to-day work? I do want to share a screen of a few resources that you are able to screenshot. Remember earlier we talked about meeting our clients' best, their basic needs, and that requires us to be aware of resources. So I do want to just quickly go through a couple slides of resources, take some screenshots, and then from there we'll close out. And then once I stop sharing my screen, I'll see if there's any questions. Thank you all again for your time. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing. I know that the work that you are doing is complex and can feel heavy at times. And so I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to attend this training. If you would like to stay connected, if you want to collaborate, if you want to continue these conversations, or if you would like me to come and speak to your organization about trauma-informed care with migrant families, here is how you can reach me. You can go visit my website, learn more about me, learn more about the work that I am doing. Um, as well as and with on the research with on the website, there's ways to kind of reach out. But if nothing else, you can reach out by admin at tonykellycounseling.com. I want to remind you that I also provide immigration evaluations. I provide clinical supervision for LMSWs who are pursuing their LCSW, as well as trainings or consultations for organizations that are working with immigrant communities. Again, I truly appreciate you taking time out of your day, and I thank you so much for coming today. And so I did want to give you an opportunity if you had any questions to ask those questions or put those questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you had any questions you wanted to ask. Okay. All righty. Alrighty. If not, then after this training, you will receive a survey just to talk about the information that was shared. Was it beneficial? Was there information you wish you would have received that you didn't get to receive in these 45 minutes? What that does is it allows me to be able to build and strengthen this training so that the work can be done and it can reach various different people, organizations, because this work is important. But again, I thank you so much for attending. If you would like to reach out to me, again, you can reach out to me at admin@tonykelly.com, tonykellycounseling.com. But other than that, again, have a great day.